Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled Conestoga River Watershed HSPF and SWAT Modeling. This webinar is sponsored by EPA's Water Quality Modeling Work Group. I am Ben Cope with US EPA and I will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. First, I'm going to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webinar. First, we hope you will have a lot of questions to ask. Please type your question in the presenter questions box on your control panel and click send question and we will receive it. If you have any problems viewing the broadcast, just let us know in the Adobe Connect help box and we will post an answer in that same box. This webinar will be archived for later viewing on EPA's Water Quality Modeling training page, and we provide that archive link for you at the bottom right of your screen. Also, at the end of today's webinar, you will be able to obtain a certificate of attendance for participating, and we'll provide directions for downloading it at that time. The materials in this webinar have been reviewed by US EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speaker today is his own and does not necessarily reflect those of US EPA. Mention of commercial enterprises, products, or publications does not mean that EPA endorses them. The purpose of today's webinar series is to help water quality professionals better understand water quality modeling and how models can be used to solve problems facing water quality regulators. The target audience for the series is a water quality professional who may use, want to use, or review models as part of their job, but who do not necessarily have a modeling background. As such, we are assuming that the audience has a basic understanding of water quality science and concepts, but has limited direct modeling experience. Today's webinar is the 19th in our water quality modeling series. All of the past webinars have been recorded, archived, and posted to EPA's YouTube channel. Links to the archived files are available on our modeling workgroup website. This URL is also shown at the bottom right of your screen. In a few weeks, a copy of today's webinar will be posted on the same website. We encourage you to listen to any of the previous webinars or share access to these files with your coworkers. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Sam Sarkar. Sam Sarkar is a water resources engineer with more than 10 years of experience. He's proficient in the development, implementation, and interpretation of watershed models and has supported local, state, and federal clients in watershed management planning, BMP implementation, and TMDL development. So now I'd like to hand over the floor to Sam to kick off today's webinar.
Thank you, Ben. Before we get started, I would like to give you a brief background on this project. This project is a part of the collaborative work done by US EPA Office of Research and Development. A brief background on the project. This project is part of the collaborative work done by US EPA Office of Research and Development, US EPA Region 3 Wetlands Program, and the Pennsylvania Dam and Safety Program. The purpose of this project is to understand the fate and transport of sediment and nutrients in watersheds impacted by legacy sediment using an integrated modeling approach. This modeling study is not in response to the Bay TMDLs or the watershed implementation plans. A report of the study is available at the EPA Science Inventory, and I think you can access the link through an archive here. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of modeling, let's understand the drivers behind this study. So let's briefly talk about the hydrogeology of the US East Coast. Pre-settlement, the streams resemble wetland systems with anabranching streams. Fast forward to the early 18th century, mill dams were constructed on many of these streams to generate water power. Rapid land clearing and intensive farming result in soil degradation and erosion and sediment accumulation in the mill ponds. Fast forward again to early to mid 20th century. The mill dams breach and water cuts through the accumulated sediment, resulting in the typical meanderings of today. With every storm, streams erode and transport the accumulated sediment. So how many dams are we exactly talking about? Studies suggest that there were more than 65,000 water-powered dams in 872 counties of the U.S. East Coast. The map on the right here shows the density of dams circa 1840. As the figure suggests, some of the highest densities of the dams are in the Bay States. In Pennsylvania alone, in Lancaster, York, and Chester counties, designated by the white circle in that same map, and also the focus area of our modeling study, there were more than 1,000 mill dams, mid to late 19th century. The picture on the bottom here shows a typical mill dam is of the Bender Mill Dam near Millersville, Pennsylvania, photographed in 1919. So now we know that there were a lot of mill dams and that sediment accumulated in the mill ponds behind these dams. But how much sediment are we really talking about? The schematic on the left shows a typical cross-section of a mill pond reach impacted by legacy sediment. The amount of legacy deposit based on the studies is generally proportional to the height of the dams, 8 feet or so, give or take. Based on a LiDAR analysis and aerial photos, a 2000 study by Walter, Meritz, and Reynes suggests that there could be as much as 100 million tons of legacy sediment in the Conestoga River watershed alone. Conestoga River watershed is our focus study area, and it is primarily in the Lancaster County of Pennsylvania. There's a map in the following slides. The erosion rate that the study suggests is anywhere between 0.2 and 0.9 tons per feet per year. The study also estimates an annual average stream erosion loading of approximately 100,000 tons per year over the past 100 years. The photograph on the right here shows a typical legacy impacted reach where you can, as is visible from the photograph, the part of the bank that is above the bankful flow, there is a lot of legacy deposit which gets transferred during large storm events. So that brings us to the focus area of the study. The focus area is the Conestoga River watershed, primarily located in the Lancaster County of the state of Pennsylvania. A 2007 USGS report suggests that some of the highest sediment yields to the Susquehanna River, which the Conestoga River is a tributary to, were from the Conestoga and identified agriculture as a likely contributing source. However, from the previous slides, we see that, and all watershed studies, that legacy sources are also important in this watershed. The objective of this project, therefore, were to determine the relative contribution of sediment and nutrients from upland and stream sources, and also to determine the efficacy of stream restoration practices in reducing sediment and nutrient output from this watershed. For this project, we adopted a desktop modeling approach using two widely used watershed models, namely the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT, and the Hydrological Simulation Program FORTRAN, or HSPF. Both models are part of the EPA basin system, and they have been widely used in watershed studies throughout the U.S. and also outside of U.S. For today's webinar, we will focus on the sediment modeling aspect of this project. A little bit about the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT. It is a watershed to basin scale semi-distributed model. SWAT allows for continuous simulation, generally daily, for hydrology, sediment, nutrients, pesticides, and metals. The basic structure of a SWAT model is shown in this schematic. Hydrologic response units, or HRUs, are the smallest physical entities in a SWAT model for which all land phase of hydrology and water quality processes are simulated. HRUs are areas of unique combinations of land use, soils, and slope in a subbasin. Many HRUs constitute a subbasin. Simulated loads are aggregated at the subbasin level by HRU and subsequently routed through the reach network. In-stream processes are simulated in the reaches. A unique aspect of the SWAT model is that it incorporates a plant growth module. Biomass and yield associated with the crop are simulated as a function of heat units and management practices specified by the user on a day-to-day basis. The choice of management practices also influence sediment and nutrient yields. This aspect of SWAT makes it particularly attractive for agricultural watersheds. In-stream processes implemented in the SWAT model are, however, not ideal, and we will discuss that in later slides. HSPF is also a semi-distributed model which can be used to simulate hydrology and water quality at a user-defined spatial scale. HSPF has a long history of development with EPA, over 55 years, and has been used in watershed studies throughout the U.S. Unlike the SWAT model, which is somewhat rigid, HSPF has a flexible framework consisting of nodes and elements. An HSPF model generally will consist of pervious and impervious land segments for which the land phase of the hydrology cycle is simulated. The load generated by the pervious and impervious land segments are transferred to the reach-res or the stream elements via the mass link block. In-stream processes are simulated in the reach-res elements. Setting up an HSPF model, however, can be a daunting task and a data-intensive exercise and often requires experience. HSPF enables dynamic simulation of water, sediment, and nutrients processes at a user-specified level of complexity. HSPF, however, does not incorporate a plant growth model. So based on the last two slides, we can therefore see that neither of the models alone are ideally suited to address both hill slope and stream components. We will get back to that, but let's take a look at the sources of sediment in a watershed and the processes associated. The watershed source of sediment generally consists of sheet and rill erosion, which are caused by the impact of raindrop and the runoff that follows. As water moves through the landscape, excessive soil detachment and removal may occur along flow lines, resulting in formation of ephemeral gullies. Channel erosion generally consists of bank and bed erosion, a result of physical processes associated with stream flow, energy acting on the channel. Bluffs are a special case of channel erosion, which consists of mass slumping of sections of bank into the channel and are a function of soil composition and moisture content. Wind erosion is the detachment, transport, and deposition of soil by wind. This can be significant in certain parts of the world, think Grand Canyon. Focusing on the simulation of the upland component by the SWAT and the HSPF model. SWAT simulates sheet and rill erosion at the HRU level using the modified universal soil loss equation or the Muesli equation. As the name suggests, the backbone of this equation is the universal soil loss equation, but the rainfall intensity factor is replaced with a product of runoff volume and peak runoff rate. The other factors in the Muesli equation are the K, or the soil erosivity factor, C, the land cover factor, LS, or the slope length factor, and the coarse fragment factor, which is basically a factor of the rock content. The coefficient A and power B, respectively, as implemented in the SWAT model for the Muesli equation are 11.8 and 0.56. These parameters were developed based on site-scale experiments in the south, and therefore we should note here that may not hold for other parts of the country. At this time, the SWAT model does not simulate gully erosion, but experimental routines have been used to simulate gully erosion in SWAT using algorithms implemented in the AG-NPS model. The figure on the right, or the schematic, shows the upland sediment processes simulated by the HSPF model. The model simulates sheet and rill erosion and gully erosion. Sheet and rill erosion is a function of KRER, which is a factor of, which is a function of K factor and the LS factor. cover, the P factor or the support factors factor, and the precipitation, along with a exponent which is user defined, which is JRER, and it generally varies between 1.81 to 2 based on all the studies that are out there. Wash-off and scour are simulated in HSPF using a power function. For wash-off, it's KSER times surface runoff raised to an exponent. So in both those equations are the surface runoff generated by the SWAT by the HSPF model. So as you can see in both the models, the amount of upland sediment generated is a function of runoff, of the amount of runoff, and therefore heavily relies on the proper representation of the hydrologic cycle. Channel processes are complex, consisting of transport, erosion, and deposition. They're complex processes. In-stream processes generally occur in 3D, and there are models that can represent such processes, but they're complex and resource intensive. For this watershed, where our study is pretty much a scoping level study, we require something that is not as data intensive as a 3D model, but also reasonably represents the processes going on in the watershed and also the stream system. HSPF and SWAT both represent streams as one-dimensional, fully mixed reactors, and therefore can only provide reach average loads. Sediment transport in the SWAT model until recently has generally relied on the Bagnall stream power equation with user-defined factors for erosion and channel cover. Sediment transport is simulated generally at the daily time step, but recent developments of the SWAT code have incorporated 4 new physically based methods that incorporate shear stress and particle size tracking. However, these routines have not been thoroughly tested. I can recall one paper that has evaluated these routines and suggests that the new routines do a decent job. SWAT also incorporates a channel widening and downcutting algorithm. The sediment transport processes simulated within the HSPF model are fairly robust. In HSPF, hill slope loads are transferred to the reach res using the mass-link block. HSPF implements a detailed in-stream sediment algorithm and has separate treatment for non-cohesive, which would be sand, and cohesive, or the silt and clay fractions. A power function is used for sand transport. Scour deposition of the cohesive fractions is informed by the distribution of shear forces versus stream flow. HSPF cannot use channel cross-section data directly. However, the functional tables in HSPF, or F tables, which are essentially stage area volume discharge relationships, can be developed based on cross-section data. This generally involves running a true hydraulic model like HECRAS that uses actual cross-section data and then using the hydraulic model output to parameterize the HSPF F tables. So the figures here show, one on the top right corner, show the typical distribution of shear forces acting on the bed versus stream flow. The shear distribution is then used to inform the thresholds for deposit and scour based on the distribution of the shear force at different percentiles of stream flow. The figure on the bottom is taken from the basin's technical note 8, which provides a comprehensive discussion of how to conduct sediment or in-stream sediment transport modeling using HSPF. So from the previous slide, we see that HSPF has a more robust representation of processes and of stream processes and is physically based. but it does not incorporate a plant growth module. SWAT, on the other hand, can explicitly simulate date-based management practices and their impact on plant growth and water quantity and quality. However, the in-stream sediment component of the SWAT model is not as robust as that of HSPF. We therefore, in the Conestoga, where both hill slope and channel are likely important sources of sediment, we need a model that reasonably represents both these sources. We therefore developed an integrated modeling approach that builds on the strengths of SWAT and HSPF. So we use SWAT to simulate the upland component or the hill slope component of the watershed, which would be the hydrologic cycle and the sediment generation at the HRU level. We then use a Python code to transfer the subbasin level SWAT output to essentially HSPF input time series. We then use HSPF reach element to route the water and the sediment through the stream networks and also simulate the processes associated with sediment transport, which would be transport, deposition, and scour. A little bit on the model development. We built the SWAT side of the model using our SWAT interface. We used a DEM along with a coverage of the historic dams in the watershed to produce a delineation or a subbasin and associated reach for each historic mill pond. That's about 169 dams in this historic dams in this watershed. We parameterized the SWAT side of the model with agricultural practices based on information from NRCS and from the extension services. The rotation simulated in the SWAT model consisted of 2-year corn and soybean, corn silage, and hay. We did a long-term simulation over a period of 30 years so that we get a true estimate of a long-term average loading from both the hill slope component and also the stream component. We used gridded meteorological data. We generally relied on PRISM for this. As I pointed out earlier, the stream component of this integrated modeling platform was generally based on the HSPF routines. HSPF uses stage area volume discharge relationships, or F tables, to represent channel hydraulic behavior and then inform that to simulate sediment transport, scour, and deposition. And again, as F tables are often informed by hydraulic and hydrology or true H&H models like HECRAS that can use actual cross-section information. For this study, for this scoping level study, though, we generally relied on regional regression equations to determine the F table for the HSPF models. The resources simply did not permit to be able to run hydraulic and hydrology models to be able to then generate F tables for the HSPF model. With the integrated modeling platform, then we tried to calibrate the model first for hydrology and then for sediment. Hydrology calibration and validation consisted of a multi-objective criteria, which included ensuring that the flow pathways were represented reasonably, comparisons of simulated evapotranspiration against satellite-based estimates, and comparison of stream flow, high and low flows, seasonal flow volumes, and a widely cited measure of model performance is the Nash-Sutcliffe model efficiency. So we evaluated the model performance against that statistic as well. SWAT has a post-processor since SWAT 2009 that can be used to see if, how the hydrologic cycle is being simulated. It generally generates a warning if there are issues which look clearly out of line. So this is a screenshot of the SWAT check program that shows the various aspects of the hydrologic cycle as a cursory check to make sure that the hydrologic cycle is not off. As mentioned earlier, we adopted a multi-objective criteria, which included comparing the simulated evapotranspiration against satellite-based products. The MOD 16 evapotranspiration dataset, which comes out of the University of Montana, is one such dataset. The USGS has an algorithm called the SSE-BOP, which is based on a surface energy balance method. So, and a paper has shown that both the algorithms produce reasonable estimates of actual evapotranspiration. So we compared the SWAT models simulated average monthly evapotranspiration against the satellite-based products. As we can see, it's the representation is reasonable. Of course, things can always be better. We also compared the crop yield model. As mentioned earlier, the major rotation simulated within the SWAT model was the grain, corn, and soybean rotation, and along with corn silage and hay. So here we compared the yearly yield as simulated by the SWAT model against USD and NAS-based estimates, and it shows that the averages are well represented, although the observed data set shows a lot more variability than the simulated data set. One of the largest components of hydrology calibration and validation is streamflow. The approach adopted here is to look at all aspects of the flow pathway, so which includes looking at the highest flow volumes, the low flows, the seasonal flows, looking at flow duration, flow accumulation, and also at the Nash-Sutcliffe model efficiency. For this study, since we are focusing on the transport of legacy sediment, it is important that the representation of stream flow at a daily time step is reasonable, because often a large amount of sediment loads are transported during one or two of the largest storm events in a year. So based on the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, we thought that this was a reasonable representation of the hydrology of the watershed. It is recommended that, generally if you're exceeding 0.7 at a daily time step, that's a fairly good representation. In this case, we were hitting 0.86. At a monthly time step, it was close to 0.95. Post-hydrology calibration, we went into sediment calibration, which consisted, again, of multi-objective criteria, which consisted of constraining the upland component based on local studies, including sediment fingerprinting studies conducted by USGS in tributaries of the Conestoga River, compare simulated and observed sediment concentration for, by month, by season, by flow, and also compare suspended sediment load to regression loads. So it is often challenging to to determine or ascertain what amount of sediment is coming from hill slope areas compared to the stream sources. Fortunately, for this watershed, there has been a lot of work done, including sediment fingerprinting, that shows that a large percentage of the sediment is associated with these legacy sources. The figure on the right is from a USGS study in the Little Conestoga Creek, which is a tributary to the Conestoga River, from 2009, that shows the relative contribution of the different sources in that small watershed. Transport analysis was done using cesium-137 for the sediment fingerprinting work. There are also a lot of local studies, including numerous studies by Walter and Meritz of the Franklin and Marshall College that have focused on different sections of the Conestoga River and their effort to quantify the amount of sediment that is being transported to the Susquehanna and ultimately to the bay. In addition, there is the Chesapeake Bay models that was also used to constrain the upland component of this integrated modeling system. A multi-objective sediment calibration criteria consists of looking at the errors by month, by flow, and ensuring that there isn't a consistent bias. It is almost impossible to reduce the error to zero, but our objective here is to reduce the bias as much as possible. Looking at the bias versus month and the bias versus flow, it looks like it's a reasonable representation. Of course, things can always be better. Calibration for sediment, in addition to looking for distribution against flow and by month, looked at standard comparison of time series, comparison of observed concentration with flow and simulated concentration with flow, all to ensure that the representation of the simulated sediment behavior was comparable to the observed sediment, both concentrations and loads. The calibration and validation of an HSPF model, in this case the linked SWAT and HSPF model, consists of ensuring that the in-stream scour deposition behavior is reasonable. So that consists of, one of the ways of looking at that would be to plot the scour or deposition on a reach-by-reach basis to see how much scour deposition is being simulated. This figure shows the scour deposition behavior associated with the 280 odd reaches in the Conestoga River model. What the figure does not show is that most of the scour here is generally associated with the former mill pond reaches, which is not hard to imagine because compared to the reaches that did not have a mill pond to begin with, there isn't the legacy sediment that can be transported for some of these extreme storm events. So the behavior here we think is reasonable because most of the erosion is isolated to the former mill pond reaches that have a lot of legacy sediment accumulated. The average erosion in tons per feet per year were also generally comparable to the watershed studies that were already done for this watershed and other neighboring watersheds. The last step in the suspended sediment or sediment calibration was to compare the suspended sediment load as observed against simulated loads. Unlike flow, there are very, it is very rare that you would find continuous suspended sediment load data. So you often have to rely on regression models, which look at the relationship between concentration and stream flow to generate monthly or daily loads. It is a little, this process often introduces a little bit of uncertainty because there is uncertainty associated with the stream flow and also the flow, also the observed sediment samples. But then again, a regression model is constructed based on these two observations. So what I'm trying to say here is it is essentially comparing one model load against another. However, that is generally the norm, and based on that, we see that the simulated loads at the monthly time step are comparable to the regression loads. So based on all the background information that went into the modeling, including other watershed studies, sediment fingerprinting studies, and this innovative linked SWAT HSPF model, we see that channel sources are dominant in this watershed. However, what we cannot ignore is that a large fraction of the load is still associated with the agricultural land, and followed by the developed land. So there is a takeaway here that had we used just the estimates from some of the other studies, it wouldn't give us this breakdown between the hill slope and the stream sources. This model also provides us a way to find or a way to figure out what is the relative contribution of the hill slope and the stream sources, not only at the watershed scale, but at the scale of these local subbasins. That is exactly what this figure shows. The figure here shows the locations of the historic mill dams, along with the total loads that is simulated by the linked SWAT HSPF system. The color, as you go from a flesh color to a more maroon tone, that just shows that the total load coming out of that particular subbasin is higher. The thickness of the reaches shows what is the relative contribution from the hill slope areas versus the stream areas. So an interesting takeaway from this figure is that while the reddest or the most maroon areas are generally located or co-located on mill pond reaches, the thickness of the blue line is also more, suggesting that a large fraction of the loads coming from some of these critical subbasins are also associated with the sediment load coming from the streams. What we also cannot ignore that there is significant loading coming from the non-mill pond subbasins as well, which tells us that the hill slope sources are also important for this watershed. So what is the point of all this watershed modeling? A watershed model generally helps us, understand where are the hotspots of, concern of pollution in our watershed. So watershed modeling can help us identify which reaches or which subbasins to prioritize for restoration efforts. Today I will not go into the restoration modeling, but I wanted to highlight an effort that has been going on in one of the smaller sub-watersheds of the Conestoga River, the Big Spring Run. This was a joint effort by several entities in the watershed. The document here is from the EPA National Risk Management Labs that consisted of restoring a part of the Big Spring Run. The photographs here show how, the reaches looked before restoration and after restoration, which consisted of removing the legacy deposits and returning them to their, initial levels. So what are the conclusions of this study? It is a scalable approach that relies on the strength of two widely used watershed models, being SWAT and HSPF. Similar approaches may be adopted for other watersheds, but both channel and hill slope sources are significant. Integrated modeling may also be adopted for other pollutants, including but not limited to nutrients, pesticides, metals, and other emerging contaminants. We were able to publish a paper out of this work. It was released online by JAWRA on February 27th. I encourage you all to take a look at that, and we'll appreciate your feedback on today's presentation and also on the general work. Next steps, we are working with the EPA National Risk Lab to see if we can extend this integrated modeling approach to nutrients as well. One of the limitations of the model is that the modeling system was run at a daily time step, which is not ideal for stream sediment processes. We would ideally love to run this modeling, at least the stream portion of the modeling, at an hourly or a sub-hourly time step. Unfortunately, we are constrained by the resolution of the SWAT model, which generally produces outputs at the daily time step if using the curved number method. Of course, the green and amp method can be used to generate water loads at the sub-daily time step, but again, we are still facing the issue of sediment loads being generated from the SWAT model at a daily time step. So we somehow have to resolve going from a daily to a sub-daily time step. Statistical methods like the random multiplicative cascade and the random forest methods have shown promise in this area, and we are trying to figure out if methods like that may be used in future improvements of this modeling system. With that, I thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, for the great presentation. This is Ben Cope again from EPA. I'm your moderator, and we're going to look on the questions, see if the questions that have come in, and go ahead and ask them of Sam. As the questions start to come in, please note that when the webinar is over, evaluation questions will be displayed. We encourage you to stay online and answer the evaluation for us to give us feedback as we listen to that and improve our webinars whenever we can. Okay, so Sam, are you ready for some questions?
Yes.
Okay, first one is, what does semi-distributed mean when you're talking about the type of model that SWAT is?
Yeah, so the terminology used is lumped parameter model. It's a lumped parameter model because you're giving the same kinds of, you're giving a collection of HRUs for a SWAT model or for pervious land segments in an HSPF model, the same parameters, as opposed to a completely distributed model, which is often gridded, and you have the ability to associate a different parameter with each grid. So So that is what a semi-distributed or lumped parameter model is.
Okay, thank you. And then we had a couple questions about the choice of using SWAT instead of HSPF. I'll ask them both. One person said, please comment on why you chose to use SWAT instead of HSPF alone for watershed simulation. And then a similar question was, why not use only HSPF, especially when Chesapeake Bay spent quite a bit of money developing customized routines in HSPF?
Yes. So, and I sprinkled this information in my talk. SWAT, one of the advantages of SWAT is that it can simulate date-based management practices. So, and it has a database of tillage practices. So within SWAT, you can specify which day you're planting a crop, what amount of fertilizer you're applying on which day, what kind of fertilizer, and therefore the processes associated with, loss via ammonification or loss via runoff pathways or leaching to groundwater, as opposed to HSPF, where you can still parameterize the model to take into account the impacts of these management practices per se, but you would have to have a fair knowledge of what it means in terms of concentrations in runoff or concentrations in interflow or groundwater flow. So there isn't a button or a schedule per se that you can implement within an HSPF model. An HSPF model can be informed using the results of a SWAT model, and that has been done in the past. But with this linked system, we are skipping that part where we would parameterize an HSPF model using the outputs from a SWAT model, and we are skipping straight to the strength of HSPF. Not to say that HSPF land routines are not developed; they're very sophisticated. But again, there is a lot of effort that goes into parameterizing and setting up an HSPF model. The advantage of a SWAT model is also that you can, and it has been widely used to understand the impacts of BMPs. So from the standpoint of the Conestoga watershed, where the upland areas consist of 82% agriculture, you would want to see what kinds of BMPs can be tested for that 24% of the sediment loading that is coming from the upland areas. While you can do that with HSPF as well, it is not as simple as saying that, okay, I will plant rye, after the harvest of corn and before I plant soybean the next year.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a little bit long, so bear with me. And here it is. My understanding is that in HSPF there is no way to separately track watershed versus in-stream sources of sediment once the sediment enters the stream. Have you found a way in HSPF to distinguish how much of the in-stream sediment load on a reach or watershed scale is from the watershed/upland sources versus erosion or scour of the sediment that is already in the stream channel?
Yes, and we do that regularly for HSPF watershed models. What you have to do is, forget about SWAT. If you just set up an HSPF model, you would have to do a reach-by-reach analysis, taking into account the connectivity of the reaches to be able to determine, at least at the local level of a stream, what is the amount that is coming from the upland areas compared to the scour/deposition sources. So that consists of, taking outputs from the HBN, the binary output file that HSPF produces, and looking at things like, and if you have some knowledge of the HSPF routines, then you can parse out the loading coming from the inflow group and then look at, depth scour variables and so on and so forth. So it is an involved process, and, we generally use spreadsheet tools that take into account, and it varies from watershed to watershed. It takes into account the connectivity between the reaches and also the upland component.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next, I think we have two questions that are also similar that I can lump. If I can find them here. So, or maybe not. Anyway, for calibration and validation, what is a time period that will make the HSPF or SWAT model? I think what the person is saying is that one would deem it to be reliable. What kind of time period would you need?
There's a great paper by by Paul Duda about this, which says that you would at least need 5 years of a 5-year calibration period and a 5-year validation period to build confidence on the ability of a model. The longer the time period, the more confidence it builds in your simulation, because you do not want to calibrate or validate your model against, a stretch of dry years or a stretch of very wet years. You want to have, a good mix of, average years and the extreme conditions. So generally, when we calibrate any watershed model, we like to calibrate it for 10 water years and then validate it for 10 water years. Of course, we are generally limited by data, and also there are other considerations like how much is your land use changing, and so that informs your parameters and all the things that come with it. So if in a watershed, where the land use is relatively stable, like Conestoga River, where it's agriculture heavy and the practices don't change much over the years, and there is data to support calibration and validation, we would use 10 years for calibration and validation. In this case, we did exactly that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You mentioned a few programs, SWAT and others, and of course the base programs of SWAT and HSPF. The question is, are these programs free to download, and what interfaces are needed to run these programs? Could you comment on some of the tools you may have used besides SWAT and HSPF?
Okay, so SWAT, for SWAT, there is the ArcSWAT interface, which is basically a add-on to ArcGIS, where you can build a SWAT model from scratch. It is available for free from the Soil and Water Assessment Tool website that Texas A&M maintains. In the recent years, there has been a version of SWAT that can be generated through the QGIS interface, so you don't even need a commercial ArcGIS package to be able to develop a SWAT model. There's, of course, Basins 4.0. That is the most recent release of Basins, which you can use to generate a SWAT model. HSPF again is publicly available, free of charge. It can be downloaded from the EPA Basins system. An HSPF model can again be developed from using the EPA Basins 4.0, and also you can use WinHSPF to develop and run an HSPF model. Unlike SWAT, which runs off of a combination of Access database and text files, HSPF generally runs off of a single file called the user controlled input. The forcings used in the model, which would include weather and output time series, they're often written to binary files to be able to save on space. But you can also use text files to both feed the model and also extract output from an HSPF model. So These models are free and they're publicly available, at least from the EPA Basins website. You can also download these programs from the respective developers who maintain the websites.
So safe to say all of the core tools you used are publicly available and free.
Correct. And I also use the open source Python programming platform to convert the SWAT time series into an HSPF readable time series. Python is again an open source program.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next question. It would be useful to consider the impact of freeze-thaw process loads and to parse out this contribution from the bank scour from storms.
Yes, I see that question is from Robert Walter. He is one of the pioneers of all the work that has been done in the Conestoga River. Dr. Walter, that is an interesting question. The problem with the freeze-thaw cycles and their impacts on sediment loads, we still haven't been able to find a model that can reasonably represent these processes. And one of my slides, touches upon this, where one of the sources of channel loads are bluffs. So bluffs, again, they are, for the, with the risk of oversimplifying this rationale, they're fairly random processes, and we still haven't found a model that can actually represent them reasonably. Within HSPF, we have tried to represent bluffs, as a constant load to the channel bed, and then we would let HSPF transport that bed load depending on the intensity of stream flow and the shear forces acting on the bed, which again is not an ideal way of representing this source. But again, we don't know of a physically based model that can actually represent these processes reasonably.
Okay, thank you. Next question, are these true suspended sediment loads or are they total suspended solids? There's a difference in a bias at the higher concentrations.
Yes, and
between the methods. Yeah.
Yes, and I am not sure at this point. I'm tempted to say that these are total suspended solids. So it is not just silt and clay. So there is a little bit of a apples and oranges here. But again, the non-silt and clay fraction is again, for the risk of oversimplifying, is probably not huge. But then that can introduce bias and uncertainties in model calibration as well.
Okay. Pretty basic question. What is meant by channel sediment sources? You want to go over how you break those down again?
Yes. So I refer you back to this slide. So the watershed sources of sediment. So channel sediment sources would be bed and bank. So this is because of the energy of the stream flow and the shear stresses acting on the bed and bank. When the shear stresses exceed the critical shear stresses for erosion, then you will see a net erosion of silt and clay load from the standpoint of the cohesive fraction. Again, HSPF is a one-dimensional model, so it does not really do a bank erosion. It does bed erosion. Another component of channel erosion are bluffs, which I was just talking about this before, where these are processes that are dependent on the composition of the soil near the banks and the soil moisture, and of course the freeze-thaw cycles, which have an impact on how much or when these blocks of soil fall into the water and then get transported. Sometimes gully erosion can also be classified as a channel erosion. It's basically formation of these ephemeral streams. So it's an extreme case of rill erosion, and usually when the depth of the rills are higher than a certain extent, you would classify them as gully erosion. So gullies can also be maybe lumped with channel sources.
Okay, Sam, one person's asked if you could, since you were moving slides around, could you settle in on the slide of the calibration of the sediment load? Maybe that person can get another look at that. They may follow up with a question. Once you're there, I'll give you the next question.
That's the load.
There you go. Okay, so the person who asked for that, there you have your slide. And we'll move on to the next question. A follow-up to my only scours the bed and not the side channels or side banks. So how did you account for that simplification?
Again, so this is a one-dimensional model, as I had mentioned. So right now, all of the channel loads we are assuming are associated with the bed sediment. So we did not per se account for the bank sources, but there are situations where when we have added and that's a limitation of the HSPF model that we recognize. It's again a one-dimensional, completely mixed stream model. So to account for bank sources, sometimes what we have done is added a constant source of load from which is supposedly representative of the bank slumping into the water, as a constant load to the bed, and then when there is a discharge that is high enough to be able to support the erosion of the bed that accounts for the amount that has fallen on the bed from the bank sources, it then simulates, it is supposed to provide a reasonable per se estimation of the total channel load coming from erosion. So to resolve the question of how much is coming from bank and how much is coming from bed, we would have to use a three-dimensional model. Again, the objective of this study was to serve as a scoping level study for the entire Conestoga River. When we focus on smaller streams, this modeling can be refined further to use, maybe a completely three-dimensional model, or maybe a 2D model like a C-qual-W2 to see, what are indeed the contributions from the bed and the bank.
Okay, thank you. The person who commented previously about TSS versus SSC, or suspended sediment concentration, just typed in afterwards that there's a couple of USGS publications that describe that for people that are interested in the difference between those measures of sediment. One is Ellison et al. 2014, and the other one is Groton and Johnson 2018. So if folks are interested in that, there's places to look up in USGS the difference between those two measures of suspended sediment. Okay, so the next question, is the importance of model accuracy considered to be the same across the watershed? I think that's saying, are you leaning more on one location to evaluate your accuracy of the model and its importance?
Yes, I mean, that's one of the drawbacks of watershed modeling per se is that one is generally limited by the amount of data that is available to calibrate the model to. So there is not there is not a definite way to say if the accuracy of the model is as good as a smaller scale compared to the scale at which we looked at. So generally, the accuracy of the model will go down as you try to look at a smaller area. So there, if it is a focus study, this model can actually provide initial parameters for that study for a more detailed look at the processes at a smaller scale.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's a question, a little bit long. You can hang in there with me. Your stream bank erosion estimates are similar to what I would expect based on my own extensive modeling in Pennsylvania. My question is, how do you separate stream channel loads coming from legacy sources versus those caused by excess runoff from impervious surfaces and stream bank erosion caused by grazing farm animal populations?
That's a great question, and that's where the scenarios come into play. Because of the extensive work that has been done in this watershed and also outside of this watershed in Pennsylvania and other states, LIDAR and aerial photographs provide a good estimate of how much legacy sediment is already there in these reaches. So that's where the power of the watershed model comes in. We parameterize with these models with mill ponds that have that actual legacy sediment. What you could do in a scenario is take out all that legacy sediment, assume that there is no legacy sediment there, and that would at a very coarse level provide a estimate of how much of that channel load was due to legacy sources and how much of that is due to other sources like cattle that are grazing very close to the bank and so on and so forth.
Okay, next question. Has a correlation ever been established between TSS and turbidity?
I'm sure that there are studies out there, and I cannot confirm nor refute, but I'm sure there are studies out there that have looked at the correlation between turbidity and TSS.
Yeah. But for your project, it was not done. Is that right?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
And we have a question. Can you define legacy sources one more time?
Legacy sources are, I'll take you back to the very first slide where we talk about the hydrogeology of the U.S. East Coast. Or this slide, this shows, where because, lots of these streams were, had mill dams along with, intensive agriculture, these dams basically accumulated a lot of sediment behind the dam in their mill pond. Fast forward to 19th century, when these dams are no longer there, they have been breached. The sediment is still there, and that is being termed as legacy sediment because it came from years or decades of intensive farming, and would probably consist of fine sediment like silt and clay that have accumulated behind these former mill dam sites, which now become a source of sediment to the Susquehanna River and ultimately to the bay.
Okay, here's a pretty quick question. Is the Python script that you developed available?
Yes, it is, and I can provide that script in a link after the webinar.
Okay, another question. For your next studies, a statistical method will be used. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? That sounds like somebody with some inside information.
Well, there is a statistical method called the random multiplicative cascade method has caught traction, and it has generally been used for disaggregation of rainfall data. It hasn't been used per se for the disaggregation of hydrology data. What the random multiplicative cascade does is that it basically looks at the distribution of a data and generates weights, which then it applies as the time series is broken down into half. So I mean that's a very basic and probably a very generic explanation of the random multiplicative cascade method. So that's one possible method. There is also the random forest method, where it's a tree-based method where a decision tree would have one tree. The random forest method uses several decision trees to arrive at a solution. So I know that random forests have been applied in other countries to look at ways of translating daily data to a sub-daily time series, but then random forests also involve training the data set and then using that trained model to do a forecast. So I'm not quite sure how we will be able to do that for this watershed, but again, we are looking at several ways. We don't know how they will work or will not work. Aside from the statistical method, we could simply use the green and amp method within the SWAT model that resolves at least the hydrology time series mismatch. We would then have to come up with a way to distribute the daily load, be it sediment or nutrients, to a sub-daily time step, maybe depending on the distribution of the flow in a given day.
Okay, in order to increase resolution on predictions on time and space, what would be the ideal size of the catchment area?
In terms of resolution of time, one could use the same model. It would be simply trying to resolve the time step mismatch between the SWAT model and the HSPF model. The green and amp method can generate large amounts of output, so I don't know for this model, which consists of about 280 watersheds, how much of model output we're talking about, and it can definitely be done, but it will probably slow the model down. When you go to a smaller scale, and if you were to use like a fully evolved 3D model, like concepts model, I know that SWAT models have been linked to concepts model to look at detailed physical processes associated with bank and bed erosion. But usually those kinds of models, you wouldn't want to parameterize them for more than 1 or 2 miles of a reach, because it becomes really, really data intensive.
Okay, next question. Can one easily view the SWAT library of land use, cropping management, practice information to perhaps apply in other models? Is this information in the user's manual?
Yes. The user's manual generally discusses the processes and also, how you would readily parameterize a model. But once someone is familiar with the SWAT interface or, the basins interface, one can easily select the crop types. One would really have to develop their own management practices based on the local management practices that are prevalent in a given region.
Okay. How do you deal with regression model error in calibration and validation of the HSPF model?
Generally, if you use a model like Lotus, and we use Flux 32. Flux 32, we have found it to be more flexible than the Lotus model in generating regression models, especially for load transport. We have found that segmented regression works better. So for Flux, we use like a segmented regression that consists of 3 segments. I'm sure that you can generate 95th percentile confidence levels associated with the regression loads. So I think that is a way to deal with the errors associated with the regression analysis. So yeah, as far as uncertainty goes, there are 2 kinds of uncertainties. There is, uncertainty associated with the parameter from the modeling itself. It's relatively easier to quantify an uncertainty associated with the parameter, but it is very difficult to assign an uncertainty because of the model structure. So from the standpoint of the water quality data, depending on field sampling techniques and so on and so forth, the uncertainties can be 5% or it could be 20%. So that's a different animal altogether to deal with.
Okay, we're gonna end on the half hour, so I have about time for about 2 more questions or 3 more questions, and then we'll be closing the webinar. How long did it take to simulate 30 years on a daily time interval?
It was less than 30 minutes.
Okay. And does SWAT estimate G and A hydraulic conductivity, K, for various combinations of land use and soil type? And maybe you can tell me tell the folks what G and A is being referred to here by this questioner.
Yeah, so G&A is green and amp method. So SWAT does calculate a infiltration rate for various combinations of land use and soil types. It is not a one-to-one implementation of the G&A method. There is it still uses the curve number method, the curve numbers that are provided to the SWAT model by land use and soil type to determine the infiltration rate on a daily basis. So to answer your question, Daniel, yes, the G&A hydraulic conductivity for various combinations of land use and soil are determined by SWAT.
Okay, and finally, is SWAT radar precipitation functionality included as an extension in recent versions of ArcGIS? I believe ArcMap 9 had such an extension. If SWAT has radar functionality, then does it use multi-sensor precipitation estimates?
I don't remember which version of SWAT this was, but I think there were some add-on documents on how to use radar precipitation data with the SWAT model. Fast forward 5 years, and now MPE data is readily, or the I blanked on the full name, but the multi-precipitation MPE data set, which is basically the stage 4 radar data set, is centrally housed by an agency where you can readily download the radar data. Of course, it's in a binary form, but with Python and other open source programming languages, you can easily unwind those and then tailor them for any watershed modeling application, be it SWAT or HSPF.
Okay. Sam, we're going to stop it right there. Thank you so much for taking so many questions after a really great presentation. So for folks, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, should you have any additional questions for Sam, or if your question today was not answered, please feel free to contact him directly after the webinar. His contact information is included on a slide we're going to pull up here in a minute. If you can get in touch with him, that information will help you do that. You can download a certificate of attendance at the link shown at the bottom right of your screen. Click on the certificate name and choose Download Files to download the PDF document, which you can personalize with the names of everyone watching from your location. You can find information on future webinars as well as a recording of today's presentation on EPA's Water Quality Modeling Workgroup webpage. The link to that page is also shown at the bottom right of your screen. Please visit EPA's Water Quality Modeling Workgroup webpage for details about the next webinar. At this time, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. Thank you again to Sam for a great job of presenting and answering questions. And of course, thanks to everyone who joined us. And please don't forget to fill out our survey. Thank you and goodbye.